top can be made in lightweight silk, as I have used here, or in a lightweight cotton, as I have done when I've made it in black and white. It doesn't have to be two-tone, and you don't have to top stitch the seams. You could even use a print and a plain fabric together. There are lots and lots of variations. Once you have cut the pattern pieces out, you will need to notch the seam allowances, as I'm showing here. This enables you to remove the pattern pieces and still see where your important allowances are. After you have cut the pattern pieces out and notched all your seam allowances and tucks into position, lift the pattern pieces from the fabric. Remove the pattern pieces and pin the tucks into position. Put this piece aside for now. You will need to master a square corner next. This is the result you are after. It is important that this looks perfect. On the pink pieces, with the right angled corners in front of you, go to the machine and stitch 2 centimetres or 1 inch from the corner. Stitch into the corner, leave the needle in, lift the foot, turn the fabric and stitch for another 2 centimetres or 1 inch. Using sharp scissors, clip into this corner, right up to the stitching but not through it. This protects your corner from fraying or going into a hole. Now take your yellow front and back pattern pieces and place them down onto the table. Pin your pink tops on, opening out your square corner. As you can see, you can open the seam out so it turns the corner sharply. Now go to the machine and stitch together on your seam allowance line. When you get to the square corner, sew right next to the stitching edge. Leave the needle in, lift the foot and turn to complete the seam. Make sure that you do both sides of the garment. Neaten these seams by zigzagging or overlock if you have one. Trim any loose threads for a neat finish. Top stitch the seam if you desire. It may be a good idea to press before you top stitch. When you top stitch, you will have the right side of the garment facing you so you can see where you are sewing. It is important that you have the seam allowance under where you're top stitching to give your top stitching some depth. I have used the width of the machine foot as a guide and have only used one row of stitching. You could put one right on the edge of the seam allowance and another one the width of the machine foot in. As you can see, I have used a contrasting colour, the yellow on the pink. Sew both shoulder seams together now and neaten separately. Make sure your garment is pressed as you sew so that you get a more professional outcome. Sew the tucks into position. This holds them in place until you are ready to stitch the bottom to the top. Make sure that you do both sides of the garment. Now we are going to French seam the bottom panels together. This will hide all the raw edges and give a lovely finish to the top. Sew with the wrong sides together, sew half the seam allowance on all three bottom panel seams. Press the seam allowance to one side. You may need to trim this seam allowance if you have any frayed edges. Now fold the seam back over itself so the right sides are together. Stitch this seam using up the remainder of your seam allowance. Now go to the machine and neaten the hem by turning the seam allowance over twice. Stitch right on the edge of this fold. Now we're going to finish the armhole and the neck edge with a binding. Use bias cut strips of 3 centimetres or 1.5 inches wide, folded in two, and these will finish off the neck and armhole edges. Cut the edge of the bias strip to square it off. Fold in 1 centimetre or 1/2 inch. Stitch, stretching slightly, starting on the seam allowance line of the neck edge and the underarm of the armhole. Sew all the way back to the beginning and cross the bind over by 2 centimetres or 3/4 inch. Cut away the remainder of the bind. Trim your excess seam allowance back to match the bind. Fold the bind into the inside of the garment and press. Top stitch on the outside to hold the bind in place. Pin the bottom of the top to the bodice, matching notches. Go to the machine, stitch this seam together and neaten. press your final garment.